My name is Josephine Clark. I'm 38 years old, and until recently, I would have described myself as someone who keeps things steady. I live in Seattle. I manage communications for a mid sized nonprofit. I remember birthdays. I send thank you cards. I know how to defuse tension at a dinner table with one sentence and a soft smile. Most people would probably describe me as calm, reasonable, or the one who never overreacts. I've heard that word my whole life. Steady. It sounds like a compliment, and sometimes it is. But sometimes steady is just another word for silent. For 10 years, I was married to a man everyone admired. He was charismatic, ambitious, the kind of person who fills a room without trying. People told me I was lucky. They told him he was lucky too, but in a different tone, as if I were a bonus feature, supportive, low maintenance, understanding. The kind of wife who doesn't make scenes. This story begins on the night of our 10th wedding anniversary. I celebrated it alone at the restaurant we chose together. Weeks earlier, we had sat at our kitchen counter scrolling through options, debating wine lists, laughing about how 10 years felt both long and impossibly short. He promised he'd handle the reservation. I remember the way he squeezed my hand and said, double digits. We should do this right. On the night itself, I arrived on time. I wore the navy dress he once said made me look quietly dangerous. I checked my phone while the hostess scanned the system. There was no reservation. I smiled. I assumed it was a mistake. I stepped aside and texted him. No answer. I sat at the bar and waited. I refreshed my messages. And while I waited, my phone lit up. Not with his name, but with notifications from friends. Happy anniversary to the perfect couple. 10 years and still going strong. Someone had reposted the photo he uploaded that morning. The two of us from a vacation last year, captioned, 10 years with my best friend. Couldn't do life without you. I answered those messages while sitting alone. That was the moment something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. There were no tears in the restaurant bathroom, no confrontation scene. Just a quiet, internal recalibration. Over the next few months, I would learn things about him, about myself, about the difference between being patient and being erased. This isn't a story about revenge. There are no screaming matches or shattered plates. There is no villain monologue. There is only the slow realization that love without respect becomes a performance. And I was the only one still rehearsing. If you've ever smiled through something that hurt more than you admitted, if you've ever wondered whether being understanding cost you something invisible, then maybe you'll understand why that empty reservation changed everything. Have you ever had a moment where the silence around you said more than any argument could? Before I was the woman sitting alone at that restaurant, I was Josephine, the reasonable one. At work, I was the person colleagues trusted with delicate emails. Let Josephine phrase it, they'd say, sliding their laptops toward me. I knew how to soften hard truths without diluting them. I understood the tone the way some people understand numbers. At home, I played a similar role. My husband, Daniel, was a visionary. That's what everyone called him. He launched projects, started conversations, and filled rooms with possibility. I handled logistics. I remembered which of his friends preferred red wine and which ones were sober. I booked flights. I packed carefully. I made sure thank you notes were sent after dinner parties hosted in our home. People often joked that I was his secret weapon. They meant it kindly, but a secret weapon is still hidden. At gatherings, conversations would arc toward him, his new idea, his promotion, his latest ambitious pivot. When someone turned to me, it was usually with a smile that felt adjacent to real curiosity. And you're still keeping him organized, right? I don't know how you do it. He'd be lost without you. I would laugh, because it was partly true. I liked being competent. I liked being the axis things spun around without wobbling. There is a certain pride in being the reliable one, the woman who doesn't create drama, who absorbs inconvenience with grace. What I didn't see then was how often my steadiness was mistaken for limitlessness. When Daniel forgot small things, a dinner with my sister, a promise to call my father back, the dry cleaning he said he'd pick up, I covered for him. He's swamped, I'd explain. Big week. When he interrupted me mid-story at a party, I'd pause and let him redirect. It seemed inefficient to compete for airtime. When he made plans without checking our calendar, I rearranged mine. None of these moments felt catastrophic. That's the thing about erosion. It never announces itself as collapse. It feels like accommodation. If I'm honest, part of me took pride in how little I required. I had grown up believing that love thrived best in low maintenance conditions. My mother used to say, men are simple, don't complicate things. So I simplified myself. I convinced myself that my quiet was strength, that my flexibility was maturity, that asking for more attention would make me appear fragile. And to the outside world, we looked balanced, complementary, the charismatic husband and the composed wife. At least, that's how they described us. But balance implies equal weight. What we had was distribution. I carried the emotional inventory of our marriage. I tracked anniversaries, conversations, subtle shifts in tone. I remembered the version of us from year 2 and quietly compared it to year 9. I noticed the increasing frequency of later, we'll see, and don't make it a big deal. No one else noticed. Why would they? I never let the cracks show. If anything, I reinforced the illusion. I posted photos. I replied warmly to comments. I stood beside him at events, hand lightly on his back, the visual language of solidarity. Inside, though, there was a slow awareness forming. Not resentment, not yet. Just a question. When you are always the steady one, who steadies you? I didn't know that question would eventually demand an answer. Looking back, I can trace the first real cut to something so small no one else would have thought to record it. It happened 3 years before that anniversary dinner. Daniel had been invited to speak at a regional leadership conference in Portland. It was a big deal for him, a stage, an audience, the kind of spotlight he moved toward instinctively. When the invitation email arrived, he forwarded it to me with one line. Looks like we're taking a little trip. I remember smiling at that word. I took the afternoon off work to help him refine his keynote. I edited slides, tightened transitions, and softened a joke that might have landed wrong. The night before we left, I printed his notes and slipped them into a clean leather folder. I even packed a backup phone charger because he always forgot his. At the conference, I sat in the third row, not the front. That felt performative. Not the back. I wanted him to see me if he looked. He did well. Of course he did. He always did. The audience laughed in the right places. They leaned forward during the vulnerable story he told about risk and resilience, a story I had gently encouraged him to include. Afterward, people gathered around him. Handshakes, business cards, Compliments. I stood slightly to the side, holding his folder, his water bottle, his jacket. At one point, a woman with a bright red blazer stepped up and said, "Your story about rebuilding after failure, that was powerful. Who helped you shape that?" Daniel smiled. "I've always been good with narrative," he said lightly. "Comes naturally." I don't think he meant to erase me. I truly don't. But I felt something sharp and precise slip under my ribs. It wasn't about credit. Not entirely. It was about acknowledgement. A simple, "My wife helped me refine it." That would have been enough. Instead, he placed his hand on the small of my back and said, "This is Josephine. She keeps me grounded." Grounded. The room nodded approvingly. The supportive wife, the stabilizer. Later that night in the hotel room, I told myself I was being sensitive. He was networking. It wasn't the time to dissect phrasing. I folded his suit carefully over a chair and set an early alarm for the drive home. But something had shifted. Not loudly, not visibly. A few weeks after that, he referenced the conference speech at a dinner with friends. "I rewrote that whole middle section at the last minute," he said, describing his creative process. I watched him speak, confident and animated. I waited for him to glance at me, to add, "Well, Josephine had a thought about it." He didn't. Our friends were impressed. I smiled. On the drive home, I almost brought it up. The words hovered at the back of my throat. "It would have meant something if you mentioned me," but I swallowed them because it seemed small, and I had trained myself to measure whether my feelings were worth it before expressing them. Was it worth the tension? Worth appearing needy? Worth derailing an otherwise good evening? I told myself no. That's how the first cut works. It doesn't demand stitches. It asks for silence. From the outside, nothing changed. We still hosted dinners. We still planned vacations. We still looked aligned in photographs. But inside, I began quietly observing. I noticed how often my contributions dissolved into the background once they had served their purpose. How frequently I was described in relation to him, steadying, organizing, supporting, rather than as someone with independent gravity. And yet, when something went wrong, a missed deadline on a shared project, a scheduling oversight, I felt responsible. I stepped in. I corrected. I absorbed. It's strange how quickly you can normalize asymmetry when you love someone. You tell yourself it's a partnership. You tell yourself everyone has roles. You tell yourself that being indispensable is its own form of appreciation. But indispensability, without recognition, begins to feel like invisibility. That conference wasn't a betrayal. It was a preview, and I filed it away. Not with anger, but with clarity I didn't yet know how to use. After Portland, nothing exploded. There were no dramatic realizations, no ultimatums, just a series of small moments that looked harmless when viewed individually. That's how normalization works. It arrives disguised as routine. Daniel began taking more speaking engagements. His calendar filled quickly, blocks of blue stretching across weeks. I became the quiet administrator of his momentum. I updated shared schedules. I rearranged my own commitments. I sent polite decline emails to events I could no longer attend because something more important had come up for him. When friends asked why I wasn't coming to a birthday dinner or a weekend getaway, I'd say, "Daniel has a big presentation. I want to make sure he's prepared." They'd nod like that made perfect sense. At first, he would thank me. "Couldn't do this without you," he'd say, pressing a distracted kiss to my forehead while scanning his phone. Over time, Even that faded. Gratitude turned into assumption. If I didn't pack his bag for a trip, he'd stand in the bedroom doorway and ask, "Did you already put my laptop charger in?" Not, "Can you?" but "Did you?" As if it were already done, as if my role was pre installed in the architecture of his life. One night, I mentioned a panel discussion I had been invited to join, a communications roundtable hosted by a national organization. It was a meaningful opportunity, something that had nothing to do with him. "That's great," he said absently, scrolling. "When is it?" "Same weekend as your Chicago trip." He paused. "Oh, just that." "Oh." Then, after a beat, "Well, you know the Chicago one is critical. Investors will be there. It might look strange if you're not with me." Might look strange. I felt the familiar internal calculation begin. Was my panel critical? No investors would be present. No one would photograph me beside a branded backdrop. It wouldn't elevate our shared image. It would only elevate me. I told the organizers I had a scheduling conflict. Daniel hugged me that night. "You're amazing, you know that." I told myself that was enough, but something subtle was happening inside me. I was beginning to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, and preemptively shrank mine to avoid conflict. It became almost elegant, efficient. If I wanted something, a weekend away, just the two of us, a conversation about future plans, more shared evenings without screens, I would frame it in a way that minimized disruption. Whenever you have a slower week, if it's not too crazy, only if it works for you. And slowly, without announcement, my desires became optional add ons rather than equal pillars. There was a dinner with his colleagues where I tried to tell a story about a campaign my team had successfully executed. Halfway through, Daniel interrupted to clarify a minor detail. Incorrectly. The table laughed at his version. I corrected him gently. He waved it off. "Right, right, that's what I meant." But it wasn't. I let it go. Later in the car, I said softly, "When you correct me in front of people, even unintentionally, it makes me feel small." He sighed. "Not angry, just tired." "Josephine, it's not that deep. We're on the same team." That phrase, "it's not that deep," became a kind of eraser. It rubbed away the outlines of my discomfort until even I questioned its legitimacy. Maybe it wasn't deep. Maybe I was magnifying. Maybe mature relationships require thicker skin. I began editing myself more carefully. Shorter stories, fewer interruptions, less visible pride in my own achievements. I positioned my accomplishments as extensions of his support. "We've both been busy," I'd say when someone congratulated me. The truth was, I was busy holding equilibrium. And the more invisible that labor became, the more automatic it felt. Not to him, but to me. Disrespect rarely announces itself with cruelty. It arrives in softened tones, in dismissals that can be reframed as oversight, in decisions made for practicality. You rationalize because you love. You rationalize because conflict feels heavier than accommodation. And before you realize it, you are participating in your own diminishing. I wasn't angry. I was adjusting, which, in some ways, was more dangerous. Because the moment you normalize being overlooked, you begin teaching people how to overlook you. And I was an excellent teacher. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you're no longer improvising. You're performing a role. I didn't notice when mine solidified. It happened gradually, like furniture settling into permanent indentations on a carpet. I was the reliable one, the calm one, the woman who smoothed over awkward pauses and anticipated needs before they were spoken. If Daniel forgot a birthday gift for his mother, I had already ordered one. If he double booked a dinner, I rearranged our plans and crafted a gracious explanation. If tension sparked between him and a colleague, I helped him rehearse a measured response. I wasn't just his wife, I was his buffer, and everyone seemed comfortable with that arrangement. At social events, people would pull me aside and say things like, "How do you keep everything so balanced?" Or, "You're so good for him." The phrasing always implied that my highest value was stabilizing someone else's orbit. No one asked what stabilized me. Over time, I began noticing the micro expectations. If Daniel had a long day, I should be understanding. If I had a long day, I should still be understanding. If he was distant, it was stress. If I was distant, it was moodiness. When decisions about our future came up, investments, travel, even the idea of children, the conversation often began with his trajectory. What makes sense for my next move? I would translate that into, how do we adjust to accommodate that? I told myself this was a partnership, that every couple naturally leans toward one person's career at different seasons. But seasons are temporary. This felt structural. There was one evening that clarified it in a way I couldn't ignore. We were hosting a dinner for 6 at our home. I had spent the entire Saturday preparing, cleaning, cooking, setting the table with the ceramic plates we bought on our trip to Vancouver. I chose candles that didn't overpower the food. I ironed the linen napkins. Halfway through the evening, someone complimented the atmosphere. "This is beautiful," one of Daniel's colleagues said. "You two are such a power couple." Daniel laughed. "Well, Josephine handles all this. I just show up." Everyone chuckled. It sounded affectionate. But the statement lingered. "I just show up." It was meant as praise, acknowledging my effort. Yet, embedded in it was an assumption so normalized that no one questioned it. Of course, I handled all this. Of course, he just showed up. Later that night, after the dishes were loaded and the house returned to quiet, I stood alone in the kitchen. My feet ached. My shoulders felt tight from hours of smiling. Daniel came in, wrapped his arms around me from behind, and said, "You're incredible. I don't know how you do it." I turned to face him. "You could," I said gently. "You just don't have to." He blinked, surprised. Not defensive, just puzzled. "What do you mean?" I searched for words that wouldn't sound accusatory. "I mean, sometimes it feels like being capable has turned into being expected." He frowned slightly. "I thought you liked taking care of things." I did. That was the complication. I liked competence. I liked creating beauty and order. I liked contributing. But somewhere along the way, contribution became obligation. Appreciation became assumption, and my silence had helped cement that transition. Because I rarely said no. I rarely allowed inconvenience to reach him. I rarely asked for reciprocal effort with the same clarity I offered mine. It dawned on me slowly. The role I was assigned was not imposed by force. It was reinforced by consistency. Every time I absorbed discomfort to maintain harmony, I strengthened the expectation that I would continue to do so. I wasn't invisible by accident. I was dependable to the point of erasure. And the most unsettling part wasn't that Daniel expected it. It was what I had trained him to. That realization didn't ignite anger. It created distance, a subtle shift from participation to observation. For the first time, I began asking myself a question that felt almost disloyal. If I stopped performing this role, who would we be? I didn't yet know the answer, but I could feel the script loosening in my hands. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen because of a betrayal, or a confession, or a dramatic revelation. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in our kitchen, under fluorescent light that made everything look flatter than it was. I had just gotten off a call with my executive director. She told me The board had unanimously approved a new initiative I had designed from scratch, a communications overhaul that would reposition the organization nationally. It was ambitious, risky, and entirely mine. When she said, "This is your strategy, Josephine. We trust you to lead it," I felt something unfamiliar. Not pride, authority. I hung up and sat there for a moment, letting it settle. No one had framed my competence as supportive. No one had described me as grounding someone else's brilliance. The success didn't orbit anyone but me. That afternoon, Daniel came home earlier than usual. He was energized, mid-sentence, before his keys even hit the counter. "You will not believe the call I just had," he said, pacing slightly. "This investor wants to fly me out next month. It could change everything." I smiled. I truly did. His excitement used to feel contagious. "Congratulations," I said. "That's big." He nodded quickly, already moving forward in his mind. "Yeah, I'll need to prep hard. It's high stakes." I waited. He didn't ask about my day, not out of cruelty, just momentum. So I said it anyway, calmly. "I had good news too." He paused, surprised. "Oh?" "The board approved my strategy. I'll be leading the rollout." There was a flicker of something across his face. Calculation, maybe. "That's great," he said. "See, things are aligning for us." For us. I studied the phrasing. My accomplishment had already been absorbed into the collective narrative. Useful because it supported the broader picture of our life, not because it was individually significant. And in that moment, something inside me grew very still, not resentful, not wounded. Still, I realized I had been waiting for years for him to meet me at equal altitude, to see me not as infrastructure but as architecture. And perhaps he never would. That evening, I opened my leather planner and began reviewing our shared finances, something I had always managed quietly. Investment accounts, property documents, retirement funds, insurance policies. I knew the numbers by heart, but I had never examined them through a lens of independence. For the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided. If I needed to stand alone, could I? The answer surprised me. Yes, more than yes. Comfortably. I had structured our finances conservatively, diversified investments, ensured transparency in legal ownership. I had done it because it was responsible. Now it felt strategic. That night, as Daniel worked on his pitch deck in the living room, I watched him from across the house. He wasn't malicious. He wasn't a villain. He was simply accustomed to a world that bent slightly toward him, including me. And I had participated in that bending. The shift wasn't anger at him. It was accountability for myself. I could no longer pretend I was unaware of the imbalance. I could no longer tell myself that love required invisibility. I had proof, in my own career, in my own capabilities, that I was not secondary material. I went to bed before him that night, not to make a point, just because I was tired of waiting for acknowledgement to arrive organically. As I lay in the dark, I didn't feel dramatic. I didn't feel ready to leave. I didn't even feel detached. I felt clear, clear that something fundamental would have to change, and clear that if it didn't, I would. Quietly, without spectacle. The anniversary dinner was still months away, but the woman who would sit alone at that table had already begun forming, not out of heartbreak, but out of recognition. Recognition that silence can be endurance, but it can also become a decision. After that Tuesday, I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't draft a speech in my head. I didn't threaten separation. I didn't even change my tone. What changed was internal. I stopped offering more than was asked. That may sound small. It wasn't. Upcoming meeting. I'd research the upcoming meeting. I'd research the attendees and summarize key details. If his parents hinted at visiting, I would begin planning accommodations before dates were confirmed. Now, I waited. If he asked, I helped, but proportionally. If he didn't, I let the silence stretch. The first time he noticed was subtle. He was leaving for a weekend conference and stood in the bedroom, scanning the room. Did you print my boarding pass? He asked. No, I replied calmly, still seated at my desk. You can check in on the app. There was no accusation in my voice, no edge, just information. He hesitated, as if recalibrating. Oh, right. He handled it. Of course he did. But something in his expression suggested mild surprise. Like someone realizing a service they'd always used had quietly become subscription based. Silence, I discovered, unsettles more than protest. When I stopped reminding him of dinners with my friends, he missed one. I didn't cover for him. I didn't craft an elaborate excuse. I simply said, he forgot. My friend nodded, slightly confused. It was the first time I hadn't softened his oversight into busyness. At home, I redirected energy. I poured myself into the nonprofit rollout. Late evenings drafting strategy. Early mornings reviewing analytics. I accepted invitations I would have once declined to accommodate his schedule. I attended a networking event alone and stayed the full 2 hours instead of leaving early to make dinner. Daniel noticed the shift but misinterpreted it. You've been so independent lately, he said one night, half smiling. I like it. Very focused. Focused. He thought my silence was productivity. In truth, it was reallocation. I was observing patterns without interfering with them, watching how often he defaulted to himself, watching how our shared calendar naturally filled around his commitments if I didn't actively counterbalance it. It wasn't bitterness, it was data. The more I withdrew invisible labor, the more visible the imbalance became, not through arguments but through friction. He forgot to RSVP to a wedding until the week before. He missed a deadline for renewing a subscription tied to one of his projects. He showed up to a dinner reservation 20 minutes late because he assumed I had confirmed the time. Each incident was minor, individually excusable, but collectively revealing. One evening, he said lightly, You've been quieter lately. Everything okay? I looked at him across the table. Yes, I said, and I meant it. Because quiet is not always distress. Sometimes it's an assessment. He leaned back, studying me for a moment longer than usual. Then his phone buzzed, and the moment dissolved. What he didn't realize was that my silence had changed categories. It was no longer an accommodation. It was a choice. When you choose silence, it carries weight. It stops being a submission and becomes a strategy. You conserve energy. You conserve words. You observe what happens when you are no longer cushioning every impact. And what happened was this. The world didn't collapse. He adjusted, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes imperfectly. But he adjusted, which meant he always could have. That knowledge was both empowering and sobering. If he could step up when required, then my constant stepping in would not be necessity. It had been a preference, convenience. I began documenting more carefully, not in a vindictive way, but in my planner. Dates of missed commitments, financial contributions, ownership structures, communication patterns, not because I was certain I would need them, but clarity feels different when it's written down. The closer we got to our 10th anniversary, the more composed I became. I planned nothing extravagant. I asked him casually, Did you make the reservation? Of course, he said confidently. I've got it. I nodded. And this time, I didn't double check. Silence had become a boundary, and boundaries reveal truth faster than arguments ever could. Preparation doesn't always look like packing boxes. Sometimes it looks like learning the difference between joint ownership and joint assumption. From the outside, nothing about my life appeared unstable in the months leading up to our anniversary. Daniel's career continued its upward arc. My nonprofit initiative launched successfully and began drawing national attention. We still attended events together. We still hosted dinners. If anything, we looked polished. What no one noticed was that I had shifted from emotional manager to strategic observer. I began meeting with a financial advisor alone, not because I suspected betrayal, not because I was planning an exit, but because I wanted unfiltered clarity. I wanted to hear someone explain my financial position without referencing you both every third sentence. The advisor, a composed woman in her 40s, reviewed our documents carefully. You've structured things conservatively, she said. That gives you flexibility. Flexibility. I liked that word. I also met with an attorney under the pretense of updating our estate planning documents. Technically, that's what we did. I brought copies of everything: deeds, investment portfolios, business agreements connected to Daniel's ventures. I asked measured questions. What would separation look like in this structure? What protections are already in place? What changes would require both signatures? There was no drama in the conversation, no hushed urgency, just information. Information is grounding. Back at home, I began scanning our life through a different lens. Not romantic, not resentful, but practical. If I stayed, what would I require? If I left, what would I lose? The surprising part was how calm I felt during this process. There was no spike in adrenaline, no secret thrill, just a quiet sense of alignment. I also paid attention to subtler forms of leverage. Daniel's public image was built on stability, on the narrative of partnership, on the optics of a grounded, supportive marriage. I had curated much of that: the photographs, the captions, the careful presence at key events. I didn't resent that work, but I acknowledged its value. I began stepping back from social media, posting less, appearing less in the background of his milestones. When people asked about our anniversary plans, I gave simple answers. Dinner at that place we love. No embellishment. Meanwhile, I strengthened my own network. I accepted speaking invitations. I deepened relationships within my industry that had nothing to do with Daniel's sphere. I built visibility that stood independently. At home, I remained composed, kind, even affectionate, but no longer anticipatory. If he wanted something scheduled, he scheduled it. If he needed feedback, he asked. If he forgot, he managed the consequences. He didn't notice the architecture changing beneath him. Why would he? The house still looked the same. One evening, I sat at our dining table reviewing documents while he rehearsed a pitch in the living room. His voice carried confidently down the hallway. And none of this would be possible without the unwavering support at home, he said aloud, practicing a line. I paused. It was a good line, audience friendly, grateful on the surface. But support, when unnamed and unexamined, becomes mythologized. It sounds noble without costing anything. I realized then that I no longer wanted to be a line in someone else's speech. I wanted authorship. The preparation wasn't about destroying him, it was about eliminating my own dependence on hope. Hope that he would notice, hope that he would shift, hope that my silence would eventually inspire reciprocity. Hope is fragile leverage. Documentation is stronger. By the time our 10th anniversary approached, I knew exactly where we stood. Legally, financially, structurally, emotionally, I was still deciding, and that decision would hinge on something deceptively simple. Whether he remembered, not the restaurant, me. The night of our anniversary arrived without ceremony. No flowers delivered to the office. No handwritten note on the kitchen counter. Just a normal Thursday that carried symbolic weight only because I still allowed it to. I left work early and went home to change. I wore the navy dress, the one he once described as making me look quietly dangerous. I applied lipstick slowly, studying my reflection not for beauty, but for steadiness. Before leaving, I checked the reservation confirmation. There wasn't one. I opened my email. Nothing. I searched for the restaurant name. Nothing. For a moment, I considered calling him. I could have framed it lightly. Just double checking the time tonight. I could have rescued the evening before it collapsed. Instead, I did something different. I trusted the silence. If he had made the reservation, the hostess would find it. If he hadn't, the truth would arrive on its own. The restaurant was warm and dimly lit, the kind of place where conversations feel protected. It was the same place we chose together weeks earlier, laughing over the menu online as if planning a small renewal ceremony for ourselves. I gave the hostess our last name. She scanned the screen. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "I don't see anything under that name." There it was. Not explosive, not dramatic, just absence. I nodded. "That's okay. Is there a seat at the bar?" She smiled and led me over. I sat down and placed my phone on the counter, face up. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I texted him, "I'm here." No reply. My phone began lighting up, but not with his name. Notifications, comments, messages. "Happy anniversary to the perfect couple. 10 years. That's incredible. He's so lucky to have you." I opened Instagram. He had posted a photo that morning, one from a vacation last year. We were standing on a cliff overlooking the ocean, wind in my hair, his arm around my shoulders. Caption: 10 years with my best friend. Couldn't do life without you. Hundreds of likes, dozens of comments, public devotion, private absence. I answered messages politely while sipping sparkling water. "Thank you. Means a lot." Time flies, doesn't it? Grateful for every year. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even embarrassed. I felt something else entirely. Clarity. This wasn't about a forgotten reservation. It was about performance versus presence. He remembered the optics, the public acknowledgement, the curated image. He forgot the physical seat across from me. I watched couples around me leaning in, sharing plates, clinking glasses. The room hummed with intimacy. My phone buzzed again. Finally, his name. Crazy day. Running late. Rain check? Rain check. 10 years. I stared at the message longer than necessary. Not because I was composing a sharp reply, but because I was measuring the weight of the moment. In that instant, all the preparation, all the documentation, all the silent recalibration crystallized into something simple. I was no longer confused. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened my planner, the slim leather one I carry everywhere, and turned to a blank page. At the top, I wrote the date. Below it, one sentence. "This is the night I stopped waiting." It wasn't theatrical. No tears slipped down my cheeks. No dramatic exit. I ordered dinner. I ate slowly. I paid the bill myself. And somewhere between the appetizer and the check, I privately acknowledged a truth I had been circling for months. I had leverage, financially, legally, socially, professionally, but more importantly, emotionally. I was no longer attached to the hope that he would transform. Hope had been my last dependency. and it dissolved at a small table meant for two. When I finally replied to his message, my words were simple: "No problem. We'll talk later." There was no accusation in it, because the reveal wasn't for him. It was for me. I drove home slowly that night, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted the transition to feel intentional. The city lights blurred softly against the windshield, rain tapping in uneven rhythm. It felt cinematic in a way I didn't dramatize, just definitive. Daniel was on the couch when I walked in, laptop open, phone in hand. He looked up with mild relief. "Hey," he said. "I'm really sorry about tonight. It got away from me." I hung my coat carefully. "It's okay," I replied. And I meant that too. Because the decision forming inside me wasn't fueled by anger. It was fueled by information. We sat across from each other in the living room, not arguing, not dissecting. He explained the investor call that ran long, the unexpected follow-up meeting, the weather delay, the cascade of busyness. All valid, all familiar. "I'll make it up to you," he said. That phrase hovered in the air between us. Make it up. As if what was missed could be compensated for with something shinier later. I studied him, not as a wounded wife, but as a woman evaluating her future. There were realistically three options in front of me. The first was confrontation. I could finally articulate every accumulated slight. The conference speech, the panel I declined, the dinners were managed alone, the emotional asymmetry. I could present evidence like a closing argument and demand structural change. The second was endurance. I could accept that this was our dynamic. Daniel would likely always prioritize momentum over mindfulness. That I could build a parallel identity strong enough to make the imbalance tolerable. Two successful individuals under one roof, loosely intertwined. The third option was irreversible: separation, not in anger, not in chaos, but in quiet clarity. Each path required something different from me. Confrontation required emotional exposure, risking that he would minimize again, or worse, agree briefly and revert. Endurance required continued self-diminishment, even if subtle. Separation required courage without applause. I didn't answer him immediately that night. I simply said, "We should get some sleep." In bed, he reached for me out of habit. I allowed it, but I noticed something. My body no longer softened automatically. Affection without alignment feels mechanical. Over the next week, I observed carefully. Did he initiate a rescheduled anniversary dinner? Did he express deeper curiosity about what the night meant? Did he ask how I felt? He sent flowers to my office 3 days later. A large arrangement. The card read, "To many more decades. Sorry, I missed the date, not the meaning." It was almost poetic, but it avoided the central issue. He missed the date because he missed the meaning, not symbolically. Practically, the decision clarified itself not through one grand moment, but through consistency. His apologies were polished, his gestures were visible, but his awareness remained surface level. He believed the problem was scheduling. I knew it was prioritization. One evening, I sat at the dining table with my planner open again. I drew two columns: stay, leave. Under stay, I wrote stability, shared history, social continuity, familiar comfort. Under leave, I wrote autonomy, alignment, self-respect, silence without performance. The second column was shorter, but heavier. I closed the planner. The irreversible option was no longer frightening. It was clean, and I have always preferred clean lines to blurred ones. That night, while Daniel worked late in his office, I drafted an email to the attorney I had met months earlier. Subject line, next steps. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled because sometimes the most powerful decision isn't loud. It's the one you make without needing anyone else to validate it. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural, not cold, not heartless, just structured. The attorney responded to my email the next morning with 3 available appointment times. I chose the earliest one and added it to my calendar without labeling it anything revealing. I simply marked it as personal. In the weeks that followed, I moved carefully, not secretively, but deliberately. There's a difference. I gathered copies of documents I had long since organized: property deeds, investment statements, retirement accounts, insurance policies, and business agreements tied to Daniel's ventures. Most were already digitized in a secure folder I maintained. Competence has a way of becoming preparation without announcing itself. I opened a separate checking account in my name only, not to hide money, but to establish financial independence as a present reality, not a theoretical one. I redirected a portion of my paycheck there, cleanly, transparently. At home, nothing looked different. We still had dinner together most nights. We still discussed schedules. We still attended a charity gala one Saturday, where we smiled for photos under warm lighting. If anyone studied those pictures, they would see composure, coordination, ease. What they wouldn't see was that I had stopped narrating our life as ours in my own mind. I began apartment hunting quietly during lunch breaks, not because I intended to move immediately, but because I wanted to understand the landscape. What did my independence cost monthly? What did it look like physically? A high rise downtown, a quieter neighborhood with trees? It felt strangely empowering to browse spaces without imagining how he would feel about them. At the same time, I maintained civility, even kindness. When Daniel mentioned an upcoming investor dinner, I listened. I asked thoughtful questions. But I did not offer to rehearse his talking points unless he requested it directly. He didn't. One evening he said, "You've seemed steady lately, grounded." I almost smiled at the irony. "I am," I said, because I was no longer negotiating with myself. The legal consultation was calm. We reviewed timelines, filing procedures, and asset division frameworks. Nothing sensational, just facts. "Are you certain?" the attorney asked gently at one point. "Yes," I replied. There was no tremor in my voice. We discussed mediation versus litigation. I chose mediation, efficiency over spectacle, dignity over dominance. At home, Daniel remained unaware of the shift beneath him. He spoke about future plans, a possible expansion to another city, a joint vacation next year, and long-term investment strategies. I listened, but I no longer merged my timeline with his automatically. There's something almost surreal about preparing to dismantle a life while still living inside it. Folding laundry, sharing coffee, watching a show on the couch. The ordinariness makes it feel unreal until you remember that endings rarely announce themselves with thunder. They begin with paperwork. I selected a tentative date to initiate the conversation. Not impulsively, not in reaction to an argument, but strategically, after a major presentation of his concluded. The disruption wouldn't be framed as sabotage. Even in departure, I refused to be cast as destabilizing. The night before that date, I sat at the kitchen table alone. My planner is open. My pen is resting across the page. I wrote one sentence: "Calm is power when it is chosen." I closed the planner and went to bed. Daniel reached for me again in his sleep, instinctive and unknowing. And for the first time in 10 years, I understood that proximity does not equal partnership. The consequences hadn't begun yet, but the architecture had already shifted, and he would feel it soon. Not because I intended to hurt him, but because I had finally stopped cushioning the impact of my own truth. I didn't choose a dramatic night, no shattered glass, no raised voices. It was a Sunday afternoon. Light came in softly through the kitchen windows. Daniel was reviewing notes at the table, preparing for a Monday meeting. I poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. We need to talk, I said, not ominously, just evenly. He looked up, mildly alert but not alarmed. Okay, I've been doing a lot of thinking, I continued. About us, about what the last few years have looked like. He leaned back slightly, attentive. This isn't about the anniversary dinner, I added. That was just clarity, not the cause. His expression shifted. Confusion first, then concern. I don't feel like an equal partner in this marriage, I said. I feel like infrastructure. He blinked. The words seemed to land harder than if I'd said something more emotional. What does that mean? He asked quietly. It means I support everything. I manage everything. I absorb everything. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being seen. He opened his mouth to respond, then paused, perhaps recognizing that immediate defense would confirm my point. I had no idea you felt that way, he said, and I believed him. That was the tragedy. Not cruelty, not malice, unawareness. I know, I replied. That's part of it. I didn't list grievances. I didn't present evidence like a prosecutor. I didn't reference Portland, the panel, or the dinners. I didn't need to. I've already spoken to an attorney, I said gently. I'm moving forward with mediation. The air in the room changed, not explosive, but thinner. You've. What? His voice remained controlled, but something inside it cracked. I've thought about this for months, I said. I'm not reacting, I'm deciding. Silence stretched between us. This time, not strategic, not observational. Real. He stood up, paced once across the kitchen. Josephine, we can fix this, he said. If you felt overlooked, we can rebalance. I can do more. I should have done more. I nodded. I believe you could, I said. The question is, why it required losing me for you to consider it. That wasn't an accusation. It was arithmetic. He looked at me then, truly looked, in a way I hadn't felt in years. You're serious, he said softly. Yes. The consequences began in small ripples. He cancelled his Monday dinner. He rescheduled meetings. He started asking questions about my feelings, about specific moments, about when this began. But the questions were retrospective. The structure had already shifted. Over the following weeks, the house felt different. Not hostile, just unsettled. He began doing things I had long handled, calling contractors, tracking bills, managing his own calendar details. Not because I demanded it, because he realized the system he relied on was withdrawing. There's a strange kind of grief in watching someone step into responsibilities they always could have carried, but didn't until necessary. Friends began sensing something. We declined invitations more frequently. I stopped appearing in the background of his social media posts altogether. When asked directly, we said we were working through things, which was true, but not in the way they assumed. The most telling consequence wasn't logistical, it was emotional. Daniel started watching me carefully, as if trying to locate the exact moment he lost me. But loss doesn't happen in a moment, it happens in accumulation. One evening, he said quietly, I thought we were solid. I met his gaze. We were stable, I said. That's not the same thing. Stability can exist without intimacy, without equality, without recognition. And once you see that distinction clearly, You can't unsee it. The consequences weren't dramatic, they were structural. And structure, once shifted, rarely returns to its original shape. Panic doesn't always look frantic. Sometimes it looks like sudden attentiveness. My meetings, not perfunctorily, but with my meetings, not perfunctorily, but with follow up questions. He handled his own travel bookings without prompting. He even suggested we attend a couples therapist. On the surface, it was everything I had once wanted: effort, awareness, initiative. But timing matters. There's a fragile window in every relationship where change feels like growth. After that window closes, the same change can feel like negotiation. One evening, he sat across from me at the dining table, the same place I had drawn the stay and leave columns weeks earlier. I didn't realize how much you were carrying, he said. I see it now. I believe that too. The problem wasn't sincerity, it was that my clarity had already solidified. I'm glad you see it, I replied softly. Truly. Then let's rebuild, he said. We can redistribute everything. We can reset. Reset. As if we were a system glitching, not a pattern revealing itself. He began recounting memories. Our early years, the tiny apartment with the broken heater, the road trip down the coast, the way we used to cook elaborate meals on Sundays. His voice softened when he spoke about those days. We were good, he said. We were, I agreed. The grief in that acknowledgement surprised me because I wasn't leaving a villain. I was leaving a dynamic. Over the next few weeks, he tried to accelerate the repair. Weekend getaways proposed, flowers sent without occasion, public posts toned down, more private gestures offered. But something inside me remained steady. When effort arrives only after the threat of loss, it carries an undercurrent of urgency that feels transactional, even when it isn't intended to. He wasn't trying to manipulate me. He was trying to preserve what he suddenly realized he valued. But value recognized too late doesn't automatically restore alignment. There was one moment that clarified it definitively. We were sitting on the couch, reviewing paperwork for mediation. Calmly, practically. He looked at the document, then at me. I can change, he said quietly. I will. I held his gaze. I know, I said, but I don't want to be the event that teaches you how. The room fell silent, because that was the truth. Neither of us could soften. I didn't want to be the catalyst for his growth at the cost of my own erosion. Growth, motivated by fear of loss, feels different than growth motivated by respect. He ran a hand through his hair, something he did when overwhelmed. So that's it? He asked. It's not anger, I said. It's completion. That word settled between us. Completion doesn't blame. It acknowledges that something has reached its natural end. In the days that followed, his panic became quieter. Not gone, but contained. He stopped proposing dramatic fixes. He started asking logistical questions instead. When would I move? What furniture would I take? How would we tell friends? Acceptance is its own kind of heartbreak, and I felt it too. But beneath the sadness, there was no doubt. The effort was real. It was simply late. And some doors don't close because they were slammed. They close because they were gently, steadily pulled shut over time. And by the time you notice, the latch has already clicked into place. The final conversation didn't feel like a battle. It felt like inventory. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table one last time before I signed the mediation agreement. The house was quieter than usual. Half the books already packed into boxes, a few framed photos removed from the walls. The absence of objects made the space echo slightly. Daniel looked tired but composed. I've been replaying everything, he said, trying to pinpoint when I lost you. You didn't lose me in a moment, I replied. You lost me in increments. There was no edge in my tone, just precision. He nodded slowly. I thought being ambitious was building something for us, he said. I didn't realize it was costing us. I know, I said again. That was the strange mercy of it. I understood him. I understood how momentum can blur perspective, how praise from the outside world can distort what deserves attention at home. But understanding someone doesn't obligate you to remain where you feel diminished. He looked at the empty wall where our wedding photo had hung. Was there something I could have done differently? He asked. The question wasn't defensive. It was earnest. Yes, I said gently. You could have noticed without being threatened. He absorbed that. I didn't think you needed more, he admitted. You seemed solid. I was, I said. But solidity isn't invulnerability. Silence settled between us again. This time, not strategic, not tense, just honest. I don't hate you, I added. That's important. He exhaled, almost a laugh without humor. That might make it worse. Maybe, I said, but I'm not leaving because I'm angry. I'm leaving because I'm clear. Clarity has a different temperature than anger. It doesn't flare, it stabilizes. He leaned forward slightly. Are you happier already? He asked. I considered the question carefully. I'm quieter, I said, and that feels honest. He studied my face, as if searching for hesitation. There wasn't any. The confrontation we never had over the years, the one that might have erupted with accusations and tears, had transformed into something far more restrained. Two adults acknowledging asymmetry without theatrics. I always thought you'd tell me if something was wrong, he said. I did, I replied softly, just not loudly. That was the final truth. I hadn't been silent. I had been subtle. And subtlety is easy to ignore when it doesn't demand urgency. He reached across the table not to stop me, not to persuade, just to hold my hand one last time in that house. I'm sorry, he said. I know, I answered. And I did. There was no final argument, no dramatic walkout. We discussed timelines, movers, and shared accounts. We divided the books. We agreed on what to say to friends. When I stood up to leave that evening, not permanently yet, but to stay with a friend while the apartment finalized, he walked me to the door. For a brief second, we stood there facing each other. 10 years condensed into silence. You were never invisible to me, he said quietly. I met his eyes. I just didn't want to be optional. That was the difference. Not unseen, unprioritized. I stepped outside into cool evening air, closed the door gently behind me, and felt something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not triumph, not devastation, just alignment. The confrontation had no heat, because the fire had already burned out. Slowly, quietly, long before either of us acknowledged the smoke. I live in a high-rise apartment 15 minutes from the non-profit office now. It's smaller than the house we shared, but the light is better. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A narrow balcony where I drink coffee in the mornings without coordinating anyone else's schedule. The first week alone felt unfamiliar, not lonely, just spacious. I kept expecting an interruption, a question about dinner, a comment from the other room. The low hum of someone else's presence shapes the air. Instead, there was quiet. And I discovered something important. Quiet, when chosen, is not emptiness, it's clarity. My days are structured differently now. I still wake early. I still track my calendar in the same leather planner. I still care about details. That part of me wasn't created by marriage, and it didn't disappear with it. But my energy flows in one direction instead of two. At work, I've stepped fully into leadership, not as the composed support behind someone else's vision, but as the architect of my own. I accepted a speaking invitation last month. National stage, hundreds in attendance. And someone asked afterward, "Who helped you shape that narrative?" I smiled. "I did," I said, not defensively, not pointedly, just factually. Daniel and I finalized the divorce without a public spectacle. Mediation worked as intended. Assets are divided cleanly. No one was humiliated. No secrets exposed. When friends asked what happened, we gave them the same answer. We grew in different directions, which is both simple and true. He has reached out occasionally, logistical questions at first, then brief updates about work. Our communication is polite and measured. There's no bitterness in it. I don't flinch when I see his name on my phone because I don't regret loving him. I regret minimizing myself. That distinction matters. I've thought often about that anniversary night, sitting alone at the restaurant, answering messages about our perfect marriage. It no longer feels painful. It feels pivotal. Not because he forgot a reservation, but because I stopped forgetting myself. There's a difference between being steady and being silent. I used to confuse the two. I believed that maturity meant absorbing discomfort without complaint, that loyalty meant endless accommodation. Now I understand that real partnership requires mutual attentiveness, not grand gestures, not public captions, but consistent presence. I'm not harder now. If anything, I'm softer, but selectively. I say no more easily. I express needs without rehearsing them for validity first. If someone interrupts me mid sentence, I finish the sentence calmly. There's a different kind of dominance in that. Not loud, not performative, just grounded. I don't know if Daniel has changed in the ways he promised. I hope he has. For himself, for whoever he stands beside next. Growth born from loss can still be real. But I am no longer available for the lesson. When I look at myself now, in the mirror, in photographs, in rooms where I stand alone, I don't see the supportive figure in someone else's narrative. I see authorship. And that feels like the truest anniversary gift I could have given myself. When people hear that I left a 10-year marriage without a scandal, without betrayal, without a dramatic explosion, they often struggle to categorize it. There was no villain, no affair uncovered in hidden messages, no shouting neighbors, just a woman who slowly realized that being appreciated publicly is not the same as being prioritized privately. For a long time, I believed love meant endurance. That if you were strong enough, calm enough, understanding enough, everything would eventually rebalance itself. But relationships don't rebalance on intention alone. They rebalance on awareness, and awareness cannot be outsourced. The night I celebrated my 10th anniversary, alone at the restaurant we chose together, wasn't tragic because he forgot a reservation. It was clarifying because I finally stopped translating absence into excuses. He forgot the reservation we made weeks before, and I sat there answering friends' messages about our perfect marriage. That contrast, public devotion, private neglect, revealed something I had been protecting for years: an image, not a partnership. There's a specific kind of strength in confrontation, but there's a quieter kind in departure. In choosing not to shout, in choosing not to expose, in choosing to leave with your dignity intact and your voice steady. I don't tell this story to encourage separation. I tell it to question silence. Are you quiet because you are at peace? Or are you quiet because you're afraid to be inconvenient? There's a difference. If I could distill the moral into one sentence, it would be this: never shrink yourself to preserve a version of love that only survives when you disappear. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't proving your worth, it's refusing to keep auditioning for it. So I'm curious if you've ever been the steady one, the understanding one, the reliable one. At what point does strength become self erasure? And how would you know the difference?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.